Alright guys, today we are going to be talking about geochemical cycles or nutrient cycles. You'll also hear these called biogeochemical cycles. The reason for that is they involve life, so bio. Alright, so remember at the beginning of this ecology unit I said that there were levels of ecological organization both below and above the organism level. So today we're going to be talking about a very small level of organization that is below the organism level that we haven't really talked about yet. So here are all the levels below the level of the organism. So the one we're going to be talking about today involves some subatomic particles, but mainly atoms, elements, and molecules. If we keep going bigger, we get up to macromolecules. So these are going to be the biologically important molecules that help build your bodies. So we're talking about fats, DNA, protein. The next level up is going to be the cell. Like I said, if it's not a cell, it's not alive. Cells can get together to make tissues. Tissues can get together to make organs. Organs can all pile on and make organ systems, and eventually we can get something really cool like a complex organism, which is a person. But like I said, today we're going to be talking about this level down here. So before we can do that, we really need to know what the heck are atoms, elements, and molecules. What is all this stuff? So geochemical cycles are basically the way that different molecules move through living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. So remember, ecology is both the study of how organisms interact with each other, but it's also how they interact with the non-living parts of their environment. So that's what we're going to be talking about. The three really important ones that we're going to be talking about today are the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and the nitrogen cycle. You're probably pretty familiar with the water cycle and the carbon cycle, maybe not so familiar with the nitrogen cycle. So this is kind of a fundamental law of physics. Since matter can't be created or destroyed, basically our Earth is a closed system, which means most of the stuff that's here has been here and it's going to stay here. It can't really escape our planet, and we're not really getting too much stuff in from outer space. Occasionally some things run into us, asteroids, stuff like that, meteorites. But overall, most of the things that are here are continually being recycled, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So before we get there, what is matter? I don't know. Let's find out. So 5 billion years ago, when our solar system was forming, it was just this molecular cloud of junk, mainly hydrogen, all hanging out, and it slowly started to condense through the power of gravity. All right? And what happens is you get stars forming that start to make more and more complex forms of matter. So what is matter? It's basically anything that has mass or takes up space. Okay, so it has mass. That means it has kind of a weight, as how we'd say it here, to make it a little bit more simple. And it takes up volume. Okay, so it displaces the space around it. So matter is basically anything that occupies space and kind of has mass. All right, so what kind of stuff is that? We're really talking about atoms here. So each atom is going to be made up of small parts, including protons, electrons, and neutrons. There are some smaller things than those, but we're really not too concerned with those in biology. We will leave that to quantum physicists. So protons have a positive charge, neutrons have a neutral charge, that's these guys, and our electrons out here in this cloud are going to have a negative charge. So really, when it comes down to it, everything we're concerned with in biology is really the interaction among differently charged particles. All right, so this proton, just like a magnet, okay, is going to be attracting these electrons. And what happens is different atoms bump into each other and they have different properties because they're differently attracted to each other based on these electrons that surround our inner proton and neutron nucleus here. So all we're really concerned about in science, if you reduce it to the smallest level, is how these different electron clouds are bumping into each other to create these complex properties that we observe. All right, so the most complex or the most fundamental property is the fact that atoms can self-assemble and form bonds. All right, So a bond is basically just the attraction between those protons and electrons. It's basically the glue that's going to hold atoms together. So they're valence electrons, so they're electrons in the outermost part of their electron configuration. That is to say, the things on the outside that are going to be bumping into other things. Those electrons basically determine how different atoms are going to interact with one another. And the way they tend to interact is by forming these bonds. So what happens here in this methane molecule we have this carbon guy here, all right? And this carbon is going to have a bunch of protons inside of its nucleus. They're going to have a positive charge, and they're going to attract other electrons. And even if those electrons happen to be attached to a different atom, all right? So these hydrogens, even though they have their own electron, that electron's going to be like, I kind of like what carbon's got going on. Carbon's got a really good positive charge. You know, it's giving me those positive vibes. I think I'm going to go check out what's happening there. And that hydrogen gets sucked over here because this is positively charged and that hydrogen has this negative charge, and it gets stuck to our carbon. And then we get something really cool like this methane here. And that simple attraction between positive and negative charges gives us all these really cool complex interactions that we talk about in biology. And the reason for this, it actually has to do with geometry. So it says here atoms are most stable when their outermost energy level is filled. What that means is they're kind of all wobbly and crazy, and they don't really want to be all wobbly and crazy, but if they can kind of fill in their, you can kind of think of it as a circle. So if they're kind of missing part of that circle, they're not really balanced. So if they kind of stick together, they get more balanced and they become more stable. They're less all wobbly and crazy. That's how I like to think about it. All right, so the really important ones that we're super concerned about in biology are these 6. Okay, I remember them by saying schnapps. No, it's not a disgusting liquor. We're talking about the most important 6 elements necessary for life. So schnapps, CHNOPS. So we're talking about carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So carbon, you've probably heard carbon-based life. Carbon is the backbone of all life. The reason for that is because, like in this image here, carbon can form 4 bonds, which is really, really cool. It's super unique, so it can make lots of really cool complex molecules. All right, so let's go back here. So carbon, backbone of life. Hydrogen, that is the most abundant element in the entire universe. Why? Because it's the most simple element in the universe. Nitrogen is important because it is going to make proteins and nucleic acids. Oxygen is incredibly important because we use it for cellular respiration. That means we use it to breathe in oxygen, and then that oxygen gets used to make really important molecules like ATP. Oxygen also combines with hydrogen to make water, which is this magical elixir that makes life possible. And phosphorus and sulfur. Phosphorus used for DNA and RNA, which, remember, we said you need to have genetic material to make up life, so phosphorus helps make that possible. And right here we have sulfur, which helps to make up amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, so that helps make you strong. All right. So let's talk about water here. Why is water this magical elixir? It has to go back to the way it bonds. All right, so 1 atom of oxygen and 2 atoms of hydrogen kind of come together and make this upside down Mickey Mouse looking thing. You can also model it with your hands like this. So your fist, let me get my head out of the way. Your fist here would be the oxygen, and your pinky and your thumb would be the hydrogens. That's how I like to model it. So what makes water so awesome is because the way its positive charge and its negative charge gets distributed, it gives it these very special properties, kind of like a really weird triangular shaped magnet. All right. So like I said, all we're concerned about in biology is kind of how these positive charges and negative charges interact with one another. Well, oxygen unlike carbon, is very, very greedy for electrons. And if you remember, electrons have a negative charge. So when hydrogen kind of bumps up against oxygen, what happens is that the oxygen's like, hey, hydrogen, give me your lunch money. All right, I'm taking your electrons. So it steals those electrons for the majority of the time. And oxygen kind of hogs one from this guy and hogs one from this guy. So if it's hogging those electrons, the oxygen kind of gets a negative charge here. And the hydrogen, now that they don't have their electrons surrounding their proton here in the middle, they kind of get a positive charge. And that distribution of charges here, the fact that half of our molecule has a positive charge and half of it has a negative charge, creates really, really incredible interactions. So we call that polarity. So kind of think about it like the North Pole and the South Pole, or the different poles of a magnet. Okay, so that's what's going on. One pole is negative, that's the side with oxygen, and one pole is positive, that's going to be the sides with hydrogen. And that right there allows this to then go and interact with a whole bunch of other molecules, and it gives us incredible things that happen because of that. Okay, the structure of DNA being one of them. All right, so that weird little attraction between water molecules is what's going to give us the really neat properties of water. Because what happens here, if you can kind of see my fists here, if I use this as a model for a water molecule, so my fist is the oxygen, which is negative. My fingers out here are the hydrogens, which are positive. What happens is if another water molecule comes around, it actually gets attracted to this. So what happens is the hydrogens of one water molecule can actually be attracted to the oxygen and another water molecule, and we call that a hydrogen bond. All right, we call this thing that I'm doing right here with my fists a hydrogen bond. So this hydrogen is attracted to this oxygen even though it's on a different molecule, and that does really, really cool things for us in biology. All right, so we don't really need to dive too deep into that, but we do need to know that water is very important simply because of that polarity and because of those hydrogen bonds. But let's zoom out a little bit and talk about what water does as far as cycling through the ecosystem and how it relates to ecology, because that's what we're really concerned with here. All right, so the chemical formula of water is H2O. It basically is super necessary for all life processes. Like I said, water or hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. Water is going to be the most abundant molecule inside of life. So like 75 to 85% of every single cell is actually going to be water. And that's due to that polarity, because that allows us to do really cool, interesting chemical things inside of cells. So water's found on Earth's surface. 97% is in the ocean, 3% is fresh water, 2% is going to be frozen in glaciers. And there's also a bunch of water underneath Earth's surfaces. So like I have a well, and that comes from groundwater. And a bunch of water is in the atmosphere, which is super helpful because it helps protect us from the the burning UV rays of the sun. And a bunch of it is found in living organisms. So let's talk about how the water cycle works. It's driven by the sun. So the sun heats up water and it makes water start to evaporate up into the air. Okay? So the main stages of the water cycle are going to be precipitation. So water is going to be falling down to the earth as a liquid, usually in rain, sleet, or snow. Then it's going to run off. So here we see precipitation. Then we see the runoff happening here. And that's going to kind of move through the environment in a couple different ways. It can either sink down into the ground, okay, and become groundwater, or it can kind of form lakes and oceans or streams. The other thing I just said is that it can infiltrate and seep into the earth. So here we see precipitation, here we see runoff, and here we see infiltration. All right, so the next stages are going to be evaporation. So the sun is going to convert our water from a liquid form to a gas form, and it's going to rise up into the atmosphere. All right. Another one is transpiration. So that's how water moves from plants So it moves from plant's roots up through the plant, and then it transpires. Okay, it's kind of like how we perspire. So when we sweat, we perspire. A plant transpires. So then that water is going to move up into the atmosphere. And finally, in the upper atmosphere, that water is going to condense and turn back into precipitation because it gets cold. And so it kind of turns back into a liquid from a gas. So how do living organisms affect the water cycle? Well, they take it in to get nutrients. So nutrients kind of bond to that water molecule, and we can take those in. Which means we also need to get rid of water, so that would be urine and feces, and we all kind of release water when we're doing cellular respiration or when we're just talking like right now, a bunch of water is coming out. So right there is the equation for cellular respiration. We'll really dive into that later, and plants are going to take up water to make sugar. So there's the equation right there for photosynthesis, and this guy right here, C6H12O6, is that tasty glucose that we all love so much. Okay, so that's why water is important for life, because it helps with cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So there's a couple ways that humans can impact the water cycle. So a negative human impact would be deforestation, because we will be decreasing transpiration. Another one that we do is we increase runoff by paving and building developments. And another one is pollution. We can pollute the water, which is very bad. Okay? So let's get into the carbon cycle. Carbon is a very, very important molecule for life because it is the backbone of basically every molecule or every large molecule in your body. You can create these really long chains based on carbon. So it helps make proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. We'll get into that. So carbon is going to be found in our atmosphere as CO2. It's found in minerals and rocks. It's found in fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. That methane molecule I showed you earlier is an example of a natural gas. And it's in our soil, okay? It's everywhere in the soil. So carbon is going to be changing forms a lot as it cycles, unlike H2O. So carbon actually gets bonded to a lot of other molecules as it kind of goes. So one example is CO2. One example there is C6H12O6, and that is our glucose. All right, so the main stages are going to be photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So this is how plants take in CO2 to make glucose, and then we actually break down that glucose and turn it back into CO2. And consumption, there you go, one organism eating another to make, to recycle our carbon here. All right, so combustion, this is one that humans do. We burn CO2 and that releases it. We burn carbon containing molecules and that releases it back into the atmosphere. Another one is decomposition. So decomposers can break down the carbon, like if a tree falls in the forest and you see fungi on it, they can break down and reuse that carbon and return it to the soil. And another one here is fossilized carbon. So back in the Carboniferous period of Earth, that's when a whole lot of vascular plants were getting deposited in swamps and eventually fossilizing and turning into these very energy-dense things that we now call oil or coal or natural gas. So living organisms in the carbon cycle, the ones that are really important here are going to be photosynthetic organisms and your decomposers. So photosynthetic organisms are going to remove CO2 from the environment. Decomposers can help break down that carbon and return it to the environment. All right. So how do we participate? Combustion is our biggest negative impact. So when we burn wood or fossil fuels, that's going to increase the CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a greenhouse gas. It's very powerful and it can be very bad. All right. Finally, we come to the nitrogen cycle, and I'm going to fly through this one because it's the most complex and it's the one we don't need to know that much about. But nitrogen is the last molecule necessary for life. It's found in proteins, nucleic acids, etc. And it's found in fossil fuels and all kinds of places. So main stages are going to be nitrogen fixation. So we can't use the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. It's actually bacteria that helps fix it for us. So in 1 single gram of soil, there's about 6,000 to 50,000 species of bacteria, and some of those help to fix nitrogen. And they fix it into a form that we can use, and then other bacteria help to convert that into something plants can use. And when plants die, or when things die, decomposers are going to return that nitrogen back into ammonia here, and that ammonia can then be recycled again by nitrification. All right, guys, that's all I got for today. I hope that was helpful, and please stay curious. All right, bye.